how old is the group? Oh, well, first of all, let's go into how old the group of the Essenes are. And again, just to recap, because I know you talked about it before, about who the Essenes are, as far as how old they are and who are they.
Good. Yeah, just so everybody knows, they were formed between, there's several discrepancies, but according to the Lama between the 2nd and the 3rd century BC. Some of the people say that they were around 200 years before Christ. It's actually closer to 300 years before Christ. And actually, if you dig hard enough, there are offshoots of the Essenes today. I mean, there's a group out in California that claims to be an offshoot of some of the teachings. The Essenes were deeply rooted into the law of Moses. But what happened to the Essenes as they started to see Judea become extremely political and shifting from God's way to fattening the calves of few politicians, they decided that they needed to get back to their roots. And so as they looked around, they thought, well, maybe if we spent a little bit more time in nature, and maybe if we begin doing some of our practices. So they started praying more, they started meditating more. And then, of course, the interesting thing is a lot of people, when they think about the Magi, a lot of times people just think about 3 wise men showing up during Jesus' birth. The Magi concept was triggered many, many moons before that. And as we talked about last week, the Magi had showed up for the birth of Mother Mary. But periodically, the Magi would come as emissaries from the City Yogas and from the Lamaseries to introduce teachings and references to the mystical group of the Essenes. Because of that, the Essenes, about 100 years into practice, begin to understand, as the City Yoga masters did, and as the Lamasery understood, connecting to nature's finer forces and the elements of nature not only strengthened the body, Jimmy, but also strengthened the spirit.
Yes.
And strengthening the spirit and forging a strong mind, they started seeing things show up relatively quickly in creation. Yep. They realized that they were going to be responsible for creating the atmosphere that the prophet Isaiah talked about when the Messiah would show up.
Right. And, not only was this talked about in Christianity or Judea, in the Judaism, but it was talked about in Hinduism. It was talked about in almost every religion about this being, right? This creator's being, son, and that's what folks want to call son, was coming. And so they were preparing it, and you said about 200 to 300, you think 300 years prior to the birth that they were here and they were preparing. And isn't it funny, this is coming from the Patriot here, that the same way that city was, that country was, is the same with the politicians and all this stuff, is the exact same way as it is today, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Power, greed, money hungry, everything for themselves, not for the all of humanity. And we could end poverty. We could end war. We could end plastic being dumped into our ocean. We could end all of that stuff. It's about where is our focus. And all these politicians, all they want to do is focus on how can I fatten up my pocket? How can I fatten up, my friends and my acquaintances, or how can I do this favor or that favor, and not look at humanity in the whole. So it really, in thousands of years, has not changed on that aspect of it. And again, I look at us folks here is a similar group of Abbas light workers, his followers, the army of God, and preparing for the next change that's going to happen. I mean, is there similarities between what's going on, where I see so many testimonials about what's happening with people right now, and what happened prior to the Son of God being born?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Jimmy, we're hearing those testimonies on the Circle of Life, as you know, right now. And see, when people start to do God's work and they realize they put the rubber to the road and the results begin to show up, they begin to show out. And so the need for spiritual patriotism has always existed. What happens then is that you get conscious people that are thinking of prevention and being the causation of things happening in creation for collective good based on the will of God the Father. And so we see it happening all over again. It's continually history repeating itself. As we know, the Cherokee Indians did that in the Smoky Mountains 400 years. You and me just became aware of in certain parts of Texas that the Comanche Nation did the same thing. We know the Hopis, thousands of years, created three cystic portals in Sedona. Imagine, we talk about one portal. This city
You mean
alone,
sustainable portals where they're
sustainable
ongoing?
portables.
Yep.
Yeah, three different portals actually exist in Sedona. Monte Picchu with the Spanish angels. The Essenes did something very profound. I mean, there to this day are field trips done in the Dead Sea where people who claim to have symptoms, what the medical field would call, a joint discomfort or arthritis, they will walk into the Dead Sea and they will come out swearing that they're feeling better. So they affected the elements. But what was powerful, they were getting ready to create an atmosphere that out of the atmosphere, if people go back to last week's episode about Mother Mary, they were creating the atmosphere to hoing the vessel that would hold God's Son. And if people understand that preparation, that you got to know that God is always on time. He sometimes, the Lama refers to him as the art director of all of creation, that he's directing all the events. And he's saying, okay, this needs to happen here, this needs to happen there. So they got together, and as the Magi would show up with the City Yoga teachings, with the Lama series teachings, and they would impart, and as they strengthened themselves, we started observing the Essenes. They started bathing in the natural bodies of water. Again, not only to cleanse their physical body, but to strengthen. So the concept to the Essenes wasn't good enough to be baptized one time. We need to be baptized daily. Wasn't good enough to just spend time with the element of fire, maybe lighting a candle at baptism. I want to spend time with the fire daily. Wasn't good enough to breathe energy or oxygen in some mud hut that they were living in. We want to go out in nature and be either in the desert or by the body of water so I can breathe the most purest form of oxygen, but also energy. And that the modus operandi of travel was our legs. And they understood. I mean, the Far East today looks at the Western world and says one of the most basic problems of coronary is not the lack of the fact that, so many cars are putting out so much carbon monoxide. A lot of people want to go that route, but it's how lazy that we became. I mean, when I was growing up, Jimmy, in a little outshoot of Nashville, I remember that we would get a horse, or we would get our bicycle, or we would just literally walk down to the closest store. Well, if we did that, that was a 5 or 6 mile hike, just one way there and one way back.
Yeah.
Today, the automobile and the motorcycle that are parked in so many people's driveways are keeping us from using our legs. The Essenes used their legs to go everywhere. So they were very connected to nature, and they understood that nature was God's playground. And they understood they were going to create an atmosphere that would cleanse this holy vessel, that Mary would be this most purest of all bloodlines of DNA passed down through man that the Bible spoke about. But so that when God's DNA entered her vessel, that there would be this extremely accepted fusion, and that the Christ child could be anointed immediately, even though, like every other human, he took years to understand who and what that he was. Now, that being said, it was in a very short time. I said on the other Daily Lama a few days ago that you had most people waking up between the concept of Jesus to Enoch and somewhere in between. And how does already at 13, 14 years old, does this being already know that something has happened to him? When he looks around, he sees it not so in every other human being. But it takes 10 years later on a mountaintop in Mount Kailash in Northeast India that Abba speaking in Master Rabbi Jesus' ear and says, "You indeed are my son, in whom I'm well pleased. You are the first awakened by my Holy Spirit, and you have been blessed with the seed of that Spirit, and forever you will be my eternal firstborn son." And that's huge when people understand what we're talking about.